As the weather is warming up, so is the race for district attorney. And without further
on point
ado,
with those transitions.
There it is. Again, last night, me, you, and Gino were at the Philly DA Town Hall last night at the Plays and Players Theater. It was a great event to attend. I'm happy that we were able to go to it. Got some great insight. And one of the candidates for Philadelphia District Attorney, one of the 7 Democrats in the field, Joe Kahn, is on the line with us right now. Joe, how are you?
Great, John. How are you?
Doing well. We appreciate the time today. So first things first, you were one of the candidates that announced he was going to seek this position before Seth Williams decided he was not seeking re-election. So, one, how long did it take you to kind of make this decision that you wanted to challenge Seth Williams?
Yeah, actually, I was the first candidate, and for a while I was the only one. And you know, this was not an easy decision because what this meant was for me, a career public servant, married to a fellow public servant who worked for Seth Williams, and being the father of 2 young kids who were counting on their parents to provide for them, what this was going to mean was my wife and I both leaving our jobs and trying to get by on just one income, and me becoming a full-time candidate running against someone who at the time had the backing of the party and had the backing of many political allies and had been raising money not just all year but for the last 7 years. So ultimately what it came down to was taking a look and realizing that no one else was willing to do this, no one else was willing to step forward, and that if I decided out of fear to let this moment go by and run the risk that Philadelphia was going to have 4 more years of Seth Williams, 4 more years of what we had endured for the last several years. I could never look myself in the mirror. I could never look at my kids in the eye and ask them to do something that was difficult but was the right thing to do. And so once I realized that I was the one I was waiting for, then I announced that I was leaving my job so that I could explore a run, and I had my last day of work at the U.S. Attorney's Office on the day after Labor Day. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of the DA's office with some brave supporters who were willing to stand beside me and stand behind me, and I declared I was running for DA.
Were you surprised that Seth Williams decided he was not going to seek another term, though?
Well, I think that one of the things that probably made this a more difficult road to hoe for him was the fact that when the campaign finance reports came out a week before his decision, they showed that a first-time candidate, someone who had not developed a political network before because his job wouldn't allow him to, someone who had never raised money before, that I had nearly 3 times the amount of campaign cash on hand as he did. And that was a result of not, just a couple people writing me big checks, but in fact, hundreds of donors, hundreds of people who wanted to see change in Philadelphia. So I think that once you realized that, not only were there a number of people willing to step forward, but one of them in particular, someone who, in contrast to being the target of a federal corruption probe, was a federal corruption prosecutor who could not only do the job, who not only had the respect of attorneys and people throughout Philadelphia, but also had the ability to run a successful winning campaign. I think all that combined with the fact that what we now know is that he, in fact, was the target of a federal prosecution for corruption probably made this inevitable.
Joe, Ryan Frascella here. I was in the audience last night with John. It was nice to hear you speak. One of the things I want to touch on is something that I know you only had a minute 30 last night to talk about it, but I want to talk about it in more detail here. And that's the issue surrounding guns and gun violence in Philadelphia. So yeah. I know I don't have to tell you, the stats, 271 shot and killed last year, but over 1,200 were just shot. And Philadelphia has one of the highest gun survival rates in the country, which then leads to an increase in retaliation violence and retaliatory violence. Yeah. So kind of what's your plan for that? Because, certainly you can't legislate retaliation, but there are certainly things you can do to prevent it. And I know for many other Philadelphians who I've spoken to, that gun violence, that going into this election, they said they may end up being single-issue voters.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right that we can't count on the General Assembly to solve this problem, because we've been waiting for years and years for them to act, and what we need is a prosecutor who can actually take action because he's done it before. When I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, when I first started there, I became the coordinator of the Violent Crime Impact Team, and so we took a multifaceted approach to dealing with this problem, and that's the kind of approach we need to deal with and take here in Philadelphia. So first of all, we have to do everything we can on prevention, right, which is doing affirmative steps in as many ways as possible, especially addressing young people, to make sure that they stay away from guns and that they're not involved in violence in the first place. And that, especially when you're talking about these opportunities where there's a motive of retaliation, right, that we're aggressive in recognizing that and doing what we can to intercede. One of the things that we did with the Violent Crime Impact Team is we identified young men, and we were looking at 3 specific police districts in West and Southwest Philadelphia, where this is back when the gun violence homicide rate was at its peak in Philadelphia. And we identified young men who were most at risk to either kill or be killed, right? And a lot of this came from exactly what you're talking about, this retaliation over gun violence, whether someone survived or they were retaliating because someone they knew had not survived, right? And what we did was we used our resources in a smart way to focus on those young men who were most at risk to be, creating homicides, right, or at risk of homicides. And by doing that, rather than throwing all of our resources into just treating everyone the same, by being focused in our approach, we were able to take very dangerous people out of the community. But we didn't stop there, and that's one of my concerns and real grievances about the current DA's office. Is there's been a real sense of satisfaction that once they have a conviction, their job is done, and it's not. So if we, for example, charge someone who had a series of felonies, violent crimes that they've committed, and then were out causing mayhem with a gun, and we're going to be looking at least 15 years in federal prison because we were taking them out of the community, we could simply rest there, or we could say, listen, we want you and maybe work some time off of your sentence if you help us solve some homicides. If you help us, tell us where you got the guns from, right? Tell us about gun trafficking rings that we can break up. Tell us about the gun shops where you're having straw purchasers go in there with a blind eye being turned by the gun shops, right? Help us make those cases. Help us shut down those gun shows. Help us solve those homicides. That's the approach that we took. Now, it takes a little bit more leadership. It takes a little more vision and creativity, but that's the kind of approach that was so successful in solving homicides and stopping some of the violence. And we can't stop there either, because I think that it's time for the district attorney's office to recognize that prosecutors have an obligation not just to punish people when they do bad things, but recognize that when those defendants, right, those offenders have paid their price to society, right, and they are now going to be coming home, we have an obligation not only to them but to society to invest in their success, right, to make sure that we set them up for success as opposed to just punishing them if they fail. And so one of the things we did in federal court is we had an extremely successful reentry program that is, in fact, a model for the rest of the country. And that focused on returning citizens, right, young men who had been to federal prison, were coming out of federal prison, and they had been in prison for violent crimes. And what we did through a series of steps was encourage their success and giving them incentives to not reoffend. And by doing that, it wasn't just good for them. It didn't just mean that their children were more likely to have a father at home as opposed to in jail. It kept people safe because it meant that we weren't going to be punishing them for violent crime, and there weren't going to be victims of violent crime. There are dozens of things we need to do. We need to do them all at once. We need to do them comprehensively with vision and with leadership.
All right, so a few follow-up questions to that. I guess mainly 2 that stick out to me is if you work with people who have maybe committed a crime with a gun, you say, hey, can you help me, nail the gun shops or nail where the guns are coming from? Does that end up still leaving dangerous people on the streets, or giving reduced prison sentences to people who are still dangerous? And then my second one is, do you think that this is feasible to implement in Philadelphia? You've had success with it in the federal system. Is it feasible for the local system?
Yes. So the answer is yes, it is feasible. What it takes is some leadership and having some sort of system in place. And so one of the reasons this was successful in the federal government is that there were a set of ground rules that everyone understood, right? So if someone was committing a certain crime, we had a sentencing system where there was some understanding of what people were looking at in terms of how much prison time they might receive if they were committing a violent crime, right? And then some sense of an understanding of when the judges look at the whole picture, the big picture of who is this person, how dangerous are they, what mitigating factors are there to allow me to give them some leniency in how they're sentenced. There was a mechanism we had in place for recognizing the role of cooperation, right? Showing that they are willing to pay their debt to society. They're not going to stick with, their pals who got them in trouble in the first place, but they're willing to try and pay their debt to society, not just by being incarcerated, but by also trying to do something productive to help save lives, right? So we had a set of principles and rules in which everyone understood this is how it would work. We had a specific federal law called the Section 5K 1.1, right? So having some level of understanding so that everyone's on the same page, that we're all playing by the same rules, it gave us some assurances that we weren't just going to turn dangerous people loose altogether simply because they did one good thing when they were still a threat to society, right? So you have to have some ground rules that give us some sort of some basic fairness, so that we're treating people the same if they're in the same situation. And so it's both feasible and it is not endanger the community. It's quite the opposite, right? This is the best way to protect the community, by making sure that we're not simply thoughtlessly locking everyone up and throwing away the key, but looking for opportunities to try and find the good in horrible situations.
Joining us on WHIP Radio right now is candidate for district attorney in the city of Philadelphia, Joe Kahn, nice enough to join us here on Rational Radio. John, Cole, and Ryan Frascella here with you. Joe, last night in your message, I like how you talked about being a lifelong Philadelphian, growing up in Northeast Philadelphia, as I'm from Northeast Philadelphia as well. So I understand that you know the city very well, and you proudly talked about being a progressive. And you said that the DA's office needs a progressive prosecutor. And you talked about your endorsement of former Governor Ed Rendell. Of course, he was DA and he was mayor of Philadelphia. But I have a question. Would you consider him a progressive, though, considering you tout being a progressive prosecutor? But I think some in Philadelphia's progressive circles would kind of consider Rendell more establishment.
Yeah, I try not to get too hung up on the labels, certainly about when it comes to talking about other people. And I think it was pretty significant, when I received Ed Rendell's endorsement, that when he talked about why he selected me over any of the other 6 candidates, including people that he had worked with, that he talked about how he liked my new ideas, my creativity to change things that he realizes when he looks back should have been different. When he looks at the cash bail system that his office was working with, whatever it was, 30-some years ago, and recognizing that was not a good system, and it would be great to have the kind of system that Joe is proposing. When I talked about a completely new way for us to think about how we police the police, right? How we have independent review to make sure that the DA's office is not too cozy with police officers that we're investigating, right? That when a shooting happens, that the community can have confidence that we are doing an actual investigation, and we're going to hold people accountable if they are committing crimes, regardless of whether they have a badge or a uniform. These are examples of how the governor pointed to the fact that I have new ideas that are long overdue, and rather than being some sort of ratification of old thoughts, one of my opponents, Michael Untermeyer, had worked for Ed, and tellingly, the governor talked about my ability to bring new ideas, not just to the DA's office, which is clearly in crisis, but to the party in general. And I think that, again, speaking for myself, one of the reasons I think it's important for us to talk about what it means, certainly what it means to me to be a progressive, is, number one, recognizing that we need to reform the criminal justice system in ways that bring down the ridiculously high level of incarceration in Pennsylvania, and make sure that we rethink enforcement policies that disproportionately impact people of color in Philadelphia. But at the same time, we have to be vigilant about asking the questions, what is the district attorney's office doing to provide access to justice to those who've been marginalized, those who've been exploited? And I have dedicated my entire career to standing up for those folks who have been left out, who've been marginalized, who are afraid to speak up. I'm talking about immigrants who, especially now, fear that any contact with the police might result in them getting deported. I'm talking about members of the LGBT community, particularly trans individuals who fear that if they have contact with the police, they will not be treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve. I'm talking about communities of color who've had many negative experiences with law enforcement and do not feel that it makes sense to speak up, especially when there's a concern of retaliation. There are so many people who suffer in silence because they don't speak up. There's so many people who don't get justice because we don't have a DA's office who recognizes that the role of government is to help the least among us. And whether that's in the legislature, whether that's in the mayor's office or governor's office or the district attorney's office, looking out for kids who are suffering from lead poisoning and asking the question, what can I do to make things better? In my view, that's what being a progressive is about. That's who I've been my entire life, and that's the kind of prosecutor I have been and will be for the city.
Joe, one final question before we let you go here. Last night you talked about your proposal to eliminate the prosecution of low-level offenses in the city, specifically surrounding the issue of marijuana. Where would you draw the line as to what is prosecuted and what isn't on kind of like the low-level offense spectrum? And do you think that, that there would be any pushback against that? We saw Bill de Blasio in New York City actually roll back some quality of life crimes in Manhattan. There was some pushback to that. Kind of what's your vision going forward to that end?
Yeah, just to be clear, I've never said all low-level offenses because I think, I'm not clear what that might mean different things to different people. What I have talked about is all the lowest-level drug offenses, and that's because, and we can be clear about what we're talking about here. We're talking about incidents where people are being arrested where the only thing that they're guilty of, right, is addiction. Right, they are being caught with drugs, and they don't intend to sell those drugs. They don't intend to deliver those drugs to some supplier. Their only intention with the drugs that they're caught with is to ingest them themselves. Right, and that is, in my view, something that should be treated not as a criminal justice issue, but as a public health issue. It's not to say that the district attorney has the power to legalize drugs. What it says is that we have prosecutorial discretion, and that while the police, if they intervene in a drug deal and they arrest the dealer, and we're going to prosecute the dealer, when the addict is approached, instead of taking that person down to central booking as well and charging them as well and having to put them through a court process as well, I want to see a system in which law enforcement helps that person into a diversionary program before they're charged. We've seen that work in places like Seattle. It's called law enforcement assisted diversion, trying to get people into treatment as soon as possible, rather than having them go through a process where they're going to end up with an arrest record, possibly a conviction, and squandering resources on a court process that are better and more effectively used on treatment.
That's Joe Kahn, candidate for Philadelphia District Attorney, joining us on WHIP, Philadelphia's #1 college radio station. Joe, thank you very much. We hope to talk to you again soon.
Guys, thanks so much.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
Excellent. So there you have it. Joe Kahn, Democratic candidate for Philadelphia District Attorney, joining us on WHIP, Philadelphia's #1 college radio station. Excellent stuff from him there.